Hola, buenos días y muchas gracias por
Hi, good morning, and thank you very much for this invitation. I wonder whether you can hear me. Unfortunately, I was unable to do the audio test before that. Could you confirm, please? Yes, we can hear you. Okay, perfect. I've also got my camera, and I'm now showing you my presentation as well. Perfect. Above all, thank you very much for the introduction. As you mentioned, I am the CCO for a small internet company in Kenya. We work particularly in rural areas. My presentation is going to be a little bit different to the ones that you have seen today and will see today, because I will emphasize more so on the role that the private sector can perform, particularly when it introduces technology in complex areas such as rural areas.
Si quieren empecemos.
So we can begin if you like. I would like to apologize because my presentation is completely in English. I'll be talking about it in Spanish. But if you have any questions or any comments, I'd be happy to answer those at the end of the presentation. So let's begin.
Bueno, entonces, el énfasis de mi presentación va a ser.
The emphasis of my presentation will be the introduction of technology in complex contexts, particularly when we're emphasizing on cost.
Ha cambiado muchísimo.
The title of my presentation has changed a lot. The title on the agenda is very different to the one I've put here. I'm really bad naming things, but basically my presentation is about rural connectivity in Kenya and why profitability matters. Before we begin, I'm going to ask you a question to provide a little bit of context about why internet penetration in rural areas is important. So, does a young child growing up in a remote village stand the same chance at success as a child growing up in an urban suburb or in a city? I'd like to present the case of William Kamkabwamba. He is from Malawi. He created a wind turbine by reading old books. He was so successful, his turbine was so good, that he managed to bring drinking water to his village. There's, in fact, a film on Netflix that narrates his life to a certain extent. He demonstrated that it's possible to reach your potential despite being in a rural area. Then we have Maureen Apu from Kenya, who had the opportunity to study IT, and she went on to become one of the most prominent people of this sector in Kenya. She also showed us that it's possible. Then we have Julius Yego, also from Kenya, who learned to throw a javelin by watching YouTube videos. He currently holds the silver medal from the Olympics and demonstrated and holds the African record. He proved it's possible too. They have come from rural areas and have shown that it's possible to get ahead, and they did so mainly because they had access to knowledge, and this helped them reach their potential. This is the power of what the internet can do. It can help us open doors and take knowledge and opportunities to places where they did not exist before. Unfortunately, connecting to the internet in rural areas is more complicated than it seems. And although it's one of our global ambitions, we're still very far from reaching this objective. Let's first ask why we're here. So as I said, my name is Alejandro Echeverria. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for Mawingu. We're a small internet provider in Kenya, and that's exactly what we do. We connect people to the internet in rural areas. The person you can see here in the picture is Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. Even though we're so small, our impact has been seen and well received by other organizations like Microsoft. In 2015, Satya Nadella came to Kenya and launched Windows 10 at a school in a rural area using our internet. After that, Microsoft gave us more than $1 million in funding to support our cause connecting rural areas. And this is why we're here, because despite being small, our impact has gained attention. Let's move on to the main subject of this presentation. The objective of this presentation is to help you understand the challenges when you're trying to connect to the internet in rural areas, why this is an important problem, and what we as Moingo are doing to try to overcome these existing barriers. Let's begin. To be able to paint the scene adequately, first of all, I'd like to start with the basics. How many people are connected to the internet since 2021? Which are the dates I have statistics for? It depends who you ask. If you ask the providers of telephone services like Safaricom, where I live, or Claro, TNT, Verizon, they will say that 95% of the world has in some way access to the internet via smartphones. But we must understand that access doesn't mean that people actually connect. And this is one of the main problems. It doesn't matter if people are covered by mobile telephones services, whether it's 3G, 4G, if they don't have the devices or the resources to be able to use that internet. So if you were to ask the UN or the World Bank, they'll tell us that in 2021, 66% of the global population was connected to the internet at some point in time. This means there were more than 5 million people who were online that year, and that's the biggest quantity that's been online in the history of the world. Unfortunately, this means that 2.7 billion people were not online. Now, if we focus on how many people were connected in rural areas in 2021, only 46% of rural inhabitants connected to the internet. If we focus on countries like African countries or developing countries, in the African continent, only 40% of the African population was online in 2021. And if we look at rural areas in Africa, only 23% of inhabitants in rural areas in Africa had access to the internet. Okay, now let's look at Kenya. Kenya is a country like Colombia. It has 50 million inhabitants who connected to the internet in Kenya in 2021. 44% of people in urban areas were connected to the internet. 17% of people in rural areas had access to the internet. In total, the country of Kenya in 2021, only 30% in total of the country was online. This is worse than the global statistics. So clearly it's a big challenge. Despite the fact that the world is moving towards digital connectivity, some countries are staying behind, and especially in rural areas. To give you some perspective, there are 12 million homes in Kenya. Out of those 12 million, only 600,000 have the internet at home. So 11.4 million homes still do not have bandwidth or broadband or internet in their homes in Kenya. So the world is moving towards global connectivity, but the challenge isn't connecting another 100 people or 1 billion people. It's about connecting the last 1,000 people who never go online. And how will we do that? This is our biggest challenge. To explain these challenges a little bit, I'm going to explain how the internet works. Please forgive me if you already understand this. I think it's worth explaining it. Forgive me for using a pixelated image. This is the best one that I could find to explain these concepts. Let's start with the basics. What is the internet? So, in summary, it's a network of devices that are interconnected around the world and exchange information. So that could be phones, computers, smartphones. All these devices are connected to a global network and share data. For example, I'm in South Africa at the moment. I'm on my computer and I'm presenting to you. I'm doing my presentation. You're all seeing it wherever you are in the world with your own devices. All of these devices are connected to this global network and they're exchanging data. So in this image, this information, this data is being represented by the cloud. What's the structure of the internet? In very general terms, you could say that the internet has 3 stages. The first is what we call the backbone in English. And it's basically cables of fiber that connect all the cities and villages and continents of the world. Fiber optics, well, in fact, it's been installed from continent to continent via oceans. This structure already exists and it's been disseminated all around the world. Even in Kenya, that's badly connected, they have fiber optics everywhere, but it doesn't reach the villages. The next layer or stage of connectivity and internet is what we call the data centers, or, well, yes, data centers. So imagine buildings filled with computers that are processing all of the information that's being transmitted via the fiber optic cables. For example, this presentation that is taking place on Zoom is information that's being transferred through the backbone, which is sending through these fiber optic cables the information, which is being processed by these buildings filled with, well, these data centers. These data centers process the information and you send it to your own devices. That's the second phase of the internet. The third phase is perhaps the most complex one. And that's where we are working, the internet providers. It's known as the last mile. This is a term that's used quite a lot. And the question is, how do you connect that last mile? So the data centers and the backbone, so the fiber optics that's disseminated around the whole world, already exists. So this final stage, the last mile, is what becomes tricky. And I'll explain why it becomes tricky. I'll give you an example. This, in fact, is a little village that barely has any people. You can, well, it's hard to see, but this is one of the little towns where we connect the internet. So there aren't really any cables taking the internet to this town. So the internet or the fiber optic cables, they're the main device used by internet providers to connect homes. Problem is that sometimes it's extremely costly, especially if there aren't enough customers to subsidize its cost. So what do? We send internet through these antennas via radio waves of 5 gigs specifically that is received by clients with these antennas with light pins in fact, these are pictures of some of our clients' homes. Now, these antennas receive the internet, which is sent from very far away. I must clarify that this is not an innovative technology. This technology is used all around the world, from Europe to Africa to Latin America. They send internet through 5 gigahertz sound waves. It's very common and it's cheaper. So that's why it's sometimes used instead of fiber optics. Why am I showing you this picture? Well, I want to get you to understand that connecting to the internet in rural areas and connecting a home to the internet isn't the tricky part. The tricky part is what comes after you connect a home, because once you install this network, you have to maintain it. These antennas and these antennas require maintenance. So you need engineers who are constantly monitoring the internet. They have to make sure that the data centers are sending the right information, because there are always mistakes or errors. You also need customer service centers for the customers, and it's important because it's expensive or it has a price. So when we're talking about connecting the internet in rural areas, the hardest part is making sure that you keep it running after you've installed it. So all of these systems require maintenance, and that's the hardest thing we found when it comes to rural connectivity, how to maintain it, especially because you're connecting rural areas where not many people can pay for these services, or sometimes they just don't have the money. So paying for the costs of the engineers and the maintenance of the hardware and the equipment and everything, where will the resources come from? So think, for example, of all the connectivity projects that have taken place in your own countries or in Colombia. Almost always, the main problem you'll find after a year or two is maintenance. How do you keep it operating after the subsidy is no longer there? Any internet provider in rural areas will find 3 main challenges. This is the second opinion. The three challenges are: how do you finance laying out your network or creating the network? The second is, how do you reach users? And the third is, how can you maintain it? How can you make this solution sustainable in the long term? So these are challenges that many organizations in various industries have tried to resolve for many years. Some have been very successful and others not so much. For example, we have the UN with its Sustainable Development Goals. In 2015, they established some goals that should be met by 2030. One of those, they said it would be achieved by 2020, which was to reach global connectivity. Unfortunately, the world still isn't completely connected. Only 66% of the world has access to the internet. So the UN, despite all its resources, still hasn't managed to close this gap. Other organizations such as Google has experimented a lot to see how they can connect rural areas. One of the most famous projects for many reasons is the Loon project, where they launched balloons that were floating relatively close to villages in Africa, and those balloons were sending internet signal to the villages, but it was more costly than expected, so unfortunately it was closed because it was not profitable. In 2013, Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook said that he would connect the whole world. Practically 10 years have gone by and the world still isn't completely connected. Despite that, Facebook has had really interesting connectivity proposals, and recently in the last few years, they launched a telecommunications project called Deep, where they have partners from all sorts of different sectors, from the public sector, the private sector, and they were doing really interesting things, but they still haven't managed to connect the whole world. We have Microsoft as well, with the Airband initiative. They're introducing all kinds of technologies. They're trying to send internet signal through television waves, but they haven't managed to reach 100% rural coverage. There are new technologies like Starlink that's sending internet to rural areas using satellites. I think this is the most interesting one of all. For now, it's extremely costly, however, to connect everybody who's in rural areas. The devices are very expensive and monthly connection fees are very high for these millions of people in Kenya who still aren't connected to the internet. So the question here, or the point and our argument today, is that there are lots of ways of connecting to the internet, but the key for it to be sustainable is to maintain it. How do you maintain those operational costs so it can be maintained after initial funding? Because if we're talking about the CapEx, as we call it, in the first question, how would you finance the structure for the network? There are many funds, capital funds, private funds and subsidies that can help to cover those costs. How do you reach the users? That's the other question. We honestly think this will happen gradually and naturally in an organic way, because the world is becoming more and more interconnected. We're not saying it's going to be easy to do, but we've seen that the world is starting to work in this way. These aren't necessarily the main ones. The most difficult obstacle is how you get this internet that you're going to install to be profitable and to be maintained over the years, because there are lots of challenges, whether it's to do with topography or logistics. Imagine if you're connecting an area that's in conflict, who's going to maintain the internet there? How will the engineers get there to maintain these antennas? So the challenge is about how to maintain them, how to keep it sustainable. That's what's going to be hard.
So why am I here in Mawingo? Why am I here in this presentation? Because we are small. We're small. So most providers, internet providers, we are also struggling of how we can connect rural areas, despite the fact this is like our most important goal. We want to connect rural areas, and even though it's really difficult to get to that point, at the beginning of our creation, from our origins of Mawingo, we never thought about finances, expenses. Our goal was to connect as much people as possible, but we did not thought about thinking of profitability. The problem is that for many years we were losing money. We were not clear of our gross margin. We did not know if we were losing money or not. What was the economic unit? And this took us to a difficult time in our company 2 years ago. We almost closed because we were out of resources. We did not have any investors, and we could not, and we had to close some villages where we were operating and we were providing internet. 2 years ago, we had and we took some decisions, but we changed the way of our company, how it operates. So since then, we have double fold. We have a gross margin of more than 65%. We have obtain expenses where we are profitable, and with our own incomes, we could expand into four new markets with no funding, with no additional funding. This has allowed us to operate in the market where we already operate, and we can provide a better quality of internet. Thank you. Thanks to this, we received a fund of $9 million investment to expand to every corner in Kenya, in the rural area from Kenya. This was possible, and this will be possible in 2023. So what do we offer, and what have we done to start growing in a profitable way? The truth is we are not offering any different what the market offers. We show and we give market 10 Mbps, 15 and 20 Mbps, and we sell it to 25, 35, and 45 US dollars. This is offered by an internet provider. What we do, which is really different with what other companies do, this is not so innovative, but it's rare. We have three. Well, our strategy is defined in three parts. One, profitability. We have spent more than 2 years thinking, but we already know exactly how much it costs to connect a customer and how we can cover the costs that we can have in them. When we are going to open in a new village, we know how many customers we need to activate so they can be sustainable. So our objective is when we go to a village and we connect, that village can be kept for 6 months. If our business model does not estimate this is not possible, we need to expand to another town or village, and we do need to know other expectations. Secondly, sales is what drives us, but always sales-driven approach for them, the villages to be sustainable. Anytime we are going to open in a village, we know, and we are opening Wajir in the north of Kenya, in the border with Somalia. We already knew that for this village to be profitable and could be sustainable, we had to connect 300 customers. So we need to know in advance how many customers we need to sell. And if this was not being possible, this is the second success, what has helped us to get to this point, sales. Third, we talk about economies of scale. As much as we sell, the cheaper it will become. So this has allowed us, the bigger our infrastructure is, the more economic will be to those villages where before it was not profitable. And this is what we are looking for. So last year, we ended 2022 with 14 villages connected. Now we are in 19 villages, and in 2 months, we will be in 27 towns. When we connect our towns, the network grows, and it will be more, it will be cheaper in small villages where they don't have enough customers, because we already have a bigger village that can subsidize, and we can be able to expand our network. This is the third part that has been able for us to grow, that the internet will be cheaper while you're expanding as much as you can make that village profitable. Now, the reason why I wanted to show you this and being here with you today is when many NGOs or the public sector thinks about what companies do, and they always sell it, and they don't sell it in an adequate way because they think that private sector talks about money. This is not true. We are always focusing on opening opportunities through connectivity, and we have clear that the only way we can be able to take internet in a profitable way through rural areas is through and making sure that the company will have some earnings, and we can be able that operations and connections that we are creating can be kept through times and be sustainable. This is why we are being able to expand. We are in 19 villages in Kenya, and we hope to be in 40 to 47 counties in Kenya by the end of 2023 through this approach that we are talking about, the business profitability. Now, I want to end up my presentation why we are thinking and we are emphasizing in the rural connectivity. In this picture, we have a school director. Her name is Beatriz. Her school was connected in 2015, and in the following 3 years after we installed the connectivity, the internet connection of the students improved their tests, and their more students were going to the university. This one we see here in the picture, this had not happened before, and this was due to the fact that the internet connection made possible the opportunity not only for teachers but for students, and open doors. This is why we are working, because we believe that rural connectivity, we are not only having an internet and we are not only selling internet connection, we are giving customers the possibility to make an affordable living so they can study, they can be with their families, to be connected with friends in remote areas. This is possible with internet, and the way we are delivering it is with profitability. So this is all for my presentation. I don't know if someone has any questions, but thank you for your attendance. Thank you, Alejandro. Really interesting.